In 1883, in a laboratory in Manchester, Osborne Reynolds sent a thin thread of dye into a glass tube of flowing water. At low speed, the dye held a single, perfectly straight line. Then he opened the valve. The same water, moving faster, tore that line into a tangle of swirls and eddies. Nothing about the water had changed but its speed, and yet it had crossed into a different world. A single dimensionless number decided which world you were in. A glass of water holds something like 10 to the 23 molecules, each one ricocheting off its neighbors. We are not going to track them. Instead, we treat the fluid as a continuum. At every point in space and every instant in time, we assign a single velocity vector. This field, u of x and t, is the object we want an equation for. There are two ways to watch a river. In the first, you stand on the bank and record the velocity at fixed points as the water rushes past. This is the Eulerian view, the field at a location, changing in time. In the second, you climb into a tiny boat and drift with the current, feeling how your own velocity changes as you go. This is the Lagrangian view, following a single parcel of fluid. Newton's second law is naturally a statement about that drifting parcel. So our first task is to express the acceleration of a moving parcel in the language of the field. This is Navier-Stokes, Part 1. We will build the equations of fluid motion from Newton's second law, one piece at a time. First, the material derivative, the acceleration of a drifting parcel. Then the forces on a fluid element, carried by the stress tensor. Then the heart of it, what viscosity really is. We assemble the full equations, and finally meet the one number that governs everything, the Reynolds number. Let us begin with a single parcel of fluid and Newton's law. Picture a single parcel of fluid drifting along with the flow. We want its acceleration because Newton's second law is about acceleration. But the velocity field gives us the velocity at a point in space, not the velocity of a parcel that keeps moving to new points. So we must be careful. Follow the parcel. Its position is x of t, and its velocity is the field evaluated wherever the parcel happens to be. To get the acceleration, differentiate with respect to time. By the chain rule, two effects appear. The field itself may change in time, and the parcel moves to where the field is different, contributing the rate of change of position dotted with the gradient of u. Since the rate of change of position is just the velocity, this second piece becomes u dotted with grad, acting on u. We give this combination a name, the material derivative, written capital du over capital dt. It has two parts. The local term is how the field changes at a fixed point. The convective term is how the parcel's velocity changes simply because it has moved to a new location in the field. Together, they are the true acceleration of the parcel. Here is why this matters. Consider a steady flow that pushes outward along one axis and inward along another, a stagnation point flow. At a fixed point, nothing changes in time. The local term is zero. And yet a parcel drifting through still accelerates, carried into faster-moving regions. That acceleration is entirely the convective term. Notice its shape. U appears twice. The material acceleration is quadratic in the velocity. This single nonlinear term is what will make the Navier-Stokes equation so hard, the source of turbulence, and of a million-dollar question we will reach in Part 2. Now apply Newton's second law to a tiny cube of fluid. Mass times the material acceleration equals the sum of the forces. Two kinds of force act. First, body forces like gravity, which pull on the entire volume. Second, surface forces. The surrounding fluid pushes and drags on each face of the cube. Look at one face. The force on it has two parts, a component perpendicular to the face, a normal stress, and a component along the face, a shear stress. To capture every face and every direction at once, we use the Cauchy stress tensor, sigma ij. The first index is the direction of the force. The second is the face it acts on. The force per area on a face with normal n is sigma dotted with n. Part of this stress is isotropic. It pushes inward equally from all directions, no matter how the face is oriented. That is pressure, written minus p times the identity. Everything left over is the viscous stress, the part that resists deformation. One more fact, the stress tensor is symmetric. Sigma yj equals sigma ji. If it were not, The imbalance of shear stresses would spin the cube with unbounded angular acceleration. Conservation of angular momentum forbids it. What does the viscous stress respond to? Not position, not velocity, but the rate at which the fluid deforms. That is the strain rate tensor, Eij, the symmetric part of the velocity gradient. In fact, the velocity gradient splits into two pieces, a symmetric part that stretches and shears the element, and an antisymmetric part that simply rotates it like a rigid body. A simple shearing flow does both at once. Only the stretching part costs viscous energy, and that is the link we follow next, from strain to stress. So what is viscosity? Imagine two parallel plates with fluid between them. Hold the bottom plate still and slide the top one. The fluid sticks to each plate, so its velocity varies smoothly from 0 at the bottom to the plate speed at the top. Each layer drags on the layer below it. The faster sheet pulls the slower one forward, the slower one holds the faster one back. Newton proposed the simplest possible rule. The shear stress is proportional to the rate of shear. The constant of proportionality is the viscosity, mu. We met the strain rate tensor last time. A Newtonian fluid generalizes Newton's rule in the most natural way. The viscous stress is proportional to the strain rate. For an incompressible fluid, the viscous stress is simply 2 mu times the strain rate tensor. The fully general law carries one extra term tied to volume change, with a coefficient often approximated by Stokes' hypothesis, lambda equals minus 2/3 mu. For incompressible flow, that term vanishes. Now put the full stress tensor into Cauchy's equation. The stress is minus P delta plus 2 MUE. Take its divergence. The pressure part gives minus the gradient of P. The viscous part, after differentiating the strain rate, gives two terms, the Laplacian of U and the gradient of the divergence of U. But for an incompressible fluid, the divergence of U is 0. That second term disappears entirely. What remains is striking in its simplicity. The net viscous force per volume is mu times the Laplacian of the velocity. And the Laplacian is the operator of diffusion, the very same operator that governs how heat spreads through a metal bar. Viscosity, it turns out, is nothing more than the diffusion of momentum. Hold on to that idea. It will return in a form you would never expect before this episode ends. We now have every piece. The left-hand side of Newton's law is mass times acceleration, density times the material derivative, which we expand into the local term plus the convective term. The right-hand side is the sum of forces from the stress tensor, minus the gradient of pressure, plus mu times the Laplacian of velocity, and any body force. Set them equal, and the equation of fluid motion appears. Read it term by term. Density times the rate of change of velocity at a point, plus the convective acceleration, equals the pressure force that pushes fluid from high to low pressure, plus the viscous force that smooths the flow, plus gravity. This is the momentum equation of Navier and Stokes. One equation is still missing. Mass cannot appear or vanish, so for an incompressible fluid, the velocity field must be divergence-free. This is the continuity equation. Together, the momentum equation and the continuity equation form a closed system. 4 scalar equations for the 3 velocity components and the pressure. The Navier-Stokes equations. Divide through by density, and the equation takes its most common form, with the kinematic viscosity nu in front of the Laplacian. Every term here is gentle and linear, except one. The convective term is quadratic in the velocity. That single nonlinearity is why fluids form eddies, why smoke curls, why turbulence exists at all. It is also why no one has proven that smooth solutions always exist. We will face that million-dollar question directly in Part 2. The same 4 equations govern honey oozing from a spoon and air screaming over a wing. So why do they look nothing alike? Honey moves in smooth, orderly sheets. Fast-moving air breaks into chaotic eddies. The equations are identical. What differs is the balance between 2 of their terms. To compare flows fairly, we strip out the units. Choose a characteristic length L and speed U, and measure everything in those units. Position in multiples of L, velocity in multiples of U, time in units of L over U. Substitute into the equation and divide through. Every term becomes dimensionless, and a single number appears in front of the viscous term. the inverse of the Reynolds number. The Reynolds number is U times L divided by the kinematic viscosity nu. It is the only parameter left. The Reynolds number measures the ratio of inertial forces to viscous forces. When it is small, viscosity dominates. The flow is thick, smooth, and laminar like honey, with a Reynolds number near 0. When it is large, inertia dominates. Viscosity can no longer smooth out disturbances, and the flow becomes turbulent. Water in a pipe reaches 100,000, air over a wing, several million. Between these regimes lies a transition. In pipe flow, the textbook critical value is around 2,300. But careful experiments by Avila and colleagues in 2011 pinned the true onset of sustained turbulence to a Reynolds number of 2,040, give or take 10. Below it, disturbances eventually die away. Above it, they survive and spread. What happens past that threshold, how order dissolves into turbulence, and the million-dollar question of whether the equations always stay smooth, is the subject of Part 2. Before we close, return to one term. The viscous force, nu times the Laplacian of velocity. We called the Laplacian the operator of diffusion. That was not a casual remark. Here is the heat equation, which governs how temperature spreads through a solid. The rate of change of temperature equals a constant times the Laplacian of temperature. A sharp spike of heat relaxes and spreads, conserving the total energy. Now strip pressure and convection from the momentum equation. What remains is the rate of change of velocity equals nu times the Laplacian of velocity, the very same equation. Momentum diffuses through a fluid exactly as heat diffuses through a metal bar, and diffusion has a deeper identity still. A century ago, Einstein showed that the diffusion equation is the fingerprint of random motion, the erratic, jittering path of a particle buffeted by molecules. The mathematics of that path is Brownian motion, whose defining signature is that the square of its increment equals the time step itself. This is the same Brownian motion that prices options in finance and that generative diffusion models reverse to create images in artificial intelligence. The viscosity of water, the cooling of metal, the wandering of a pollen grain, the noise inside a neural network. One operator, 4 worlds. In this episode, we followed a single parcel of fluid through Newton's second law. We built the material derivative, found the forces hiding in the stress tensor, discovered that viscosity is the diffusion of momentum, assembled the Navier-Stokes equations, and met the Reynolds number that decides their character. One term we did not tame, the nonlinear convective term. In Part 2, it comes for us. We will follow vorticity, watch laminar flow shatter into turbulence, and confront the Clay Millennium problem worth $1 million that asks whether these equations always have smooth solutions. The references are on screen. Thank you for watching.